Good afternoon and welcome to the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. And we are back with our Beyond the Basics cover crop series of in-person discussions on cover crops. And guess I'll introduce myself before I introduce our guest today. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, ISU Extension and Outreach, and Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. Welcome everybody to the webinar series. If you haven't been on before, and those that have, thanks for being willing to tune in again today. I'm really excited for this webinar. Hopefully we don't go off the rails with this, but I'm excited to introduce my colleague in the Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering Department and friend, Dr. Dan Andersen. Dr. Andersen goes by Dr. Manure on social media. Does a great job with manure management in the state of Iowa, really one of the world experts in this area. So we're going to talk about kind of manure and cover crops. As always with this format, if you have questions, please type those into the chat box and we'll get to those. I have a few questions to ask Dan, but this will be a lot more fun if we get your questions answered. So anything you want to know about manure and cover crops, please type those in. But let's start off with, Dan, tell me a little bit about your background, where you come from, and what brought you to Iowa State?
Well, this is an interesting question. Okay, so I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, right? If you're from Wisconsin, you probably came from a dairy farm. Not true anymore, but when I was young, there was lots of dairy farms. We milked about 30 cows, farmed 110 acres. So it was below average size even back then. And I'd like to tell you, we did things great. But we applied manure every day, really common for a dairy farm that size. And I learned, knock down the snowbank where you're going to apply tomorrow, today, right? So you don't get stuck. And I thought, there's got to be better ways to do this. And that's sort of what led me into manure. But I will say, one thing that's sort of neat about cover crops is my dad was actually relatively creative with his rotations, right? We grew a ton of alfalfa, a ton of clover. If you're growing forages like that, you probably small grain oats in front of it as a sort of cover to get it going. But then he was actually kind of risk-taking. Like if we didn't get corn in, we'd switch to sorghum to make a forage. Or if we didn't get corn in, we'd make barley to feed. So we did a lot of different things. We had really wet ground, and unlike Iowa, we weren't tile drained. So if it was wet in the spring, you didn't get in. And then I went to Platteville, home of the world's largest letter M. If you're ever driving 151, be sure to look at it. It's a glorious achievement for mankind. And then after that, I had the opportunity to come to Iowa State and work for Robert Burns. And I was like, talk about manure, think about poop. Like this reminds me of my childhood. And I'd worked a co-op at Kerwood. And they make plastic packaging. They make 90% of the bacon packaging in the U.S. And it was a great experience. I learned a lot about engineering. But more than that, I learned I am not capable of working a job where you show up in the dark and leave in the dark and never see the light of day. So this was an opportunity to be an engineer and be outside.
Okay. There is one chat in there I just want to address right now. Is anybody else having an echo issue on there? So if somebody can type that in, we'll try to get that. Oh, they might be in twice. Nobody. Okay. All right. That got me off, but that helped with the interest in manure. So how long have you been at Iowa State?
Well, I've been employed as a professor now for 14 years, so a long time. But I did my grad degrees here, so if I throw that in, I think I get to say 20.
Okay, all right.
Which means I'm now an Iowan and not a Wisconsinite.
That's right. There we go. Well, no, I guess I won't say you've lived in Iowa longer than you've lived in Wisconsin, but pretty soon here. Okay, so let's think about manure. I guess, can you talk about the value that manure has to Iowa's cropping system?
Okay, I'm going to brag up Iowa for a second. Really, when we look at the manure system, Iowa's done a great job. We recognized it was a fertilizer and started picking production systems to try and use it better as a fertilizer, I would say in the early 2000s. And that probably is ahead of most states.
Okay.
And I also think we take credit for manure better than many states. Fun fact for you, you might think we have more manure today than we've ever had. And we've actually only reached 1970s levels again. So in the 70s, we were a cattle state, and it took a long time to get back to the same amount of manure production. But we have more nitrogen produced and more nitrogen available because we switched some manure types. So when you look at sort of Iowa as a whole, we apply manure on about 20 to 25% of all our crop acres. And it's about 1/3 of all the fertilizer, right? So
Okay.
if you just think about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that we're purchasing compared to how much is excreted with manure, it's 1/3 from manure, 2/3 from other places. And I think that's not always a perception we have. People often think there's too much manure. And depending on where you live in Iowa, I don't want to make it sound like that isn't true.
Yeah.
Some places have a lot of manure,
Yeah.
but there's other places that we really need those nutrients, and farmers are trying to pick production systems and practices to really take advantage of it. This year more than ever. And I think when you look at maybe how Iowa's progressed from the 2000s, every time we've had high fertilizer prices, we really start to make decisions to better utilize manure.
Yeah.
So we went from a lot of open lots to people really starting building bed pack and deep pit beef barns sort of in the 2010s,
Yeah.
fertilizer prices. We did some research on how good does a manifold work. In the sort of 2014 era, high fertilizer prices, people picked it up really quickly and ran with that. So I think Iowa's been hungry for information on really what's the next step? How can we do a little better? And they demand that they practices
Yeah.
pay off, but they want to know what are the options? What can I be doing? Where should I be moving?
Yeah. In fact, I think I just brought it up yesterday about the importance of the manure application kind of distribution system that you and Dr. Capil Aurora did. That sometimes I think is some of the most impactful work, but I think has really improved the uniformity of application across the toolbar.
And that was really a little bit of an Iowa specific problem. Our growers were much more proactive about water conservation in barns, cranking up nutrient concentration. So our rates that people needed to hit were lower than everywhere else. And that distribution problem gets amplified the lower rate you're trying to hit.
Okay.
So it was an Iowa centric problem, but I think it really did change the manure industry to really think about how do we make this work so that people can respect it and want to use it.
And the industry has kind of adopted some of that,
Absolutely.
that work that you've done there.
Yeah, so almost everyone's went to the better style of manifold that we've seen, sort of a hydroflow style. It's a round chamber hydraulic pump in it, has some blocking occasionally to make sure that it's maintaining pressure in there.
Okay.
But we've seen a lot of innovation beyond that. So we sort of did you can't really pump manure to the high side of a toolbar if you're on a slope. And everyone knew this, and we sort of looked the other way. And now people are thinking, well, as toolbars get wider, do we need 2 distributors or 3 distributors so that we pre-split to get some manure up to the high side of the toolbar rather than only on the low side?
Okay.
Fun times if you're geeking out on manure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, all right. But yeah, and which is something people can ask questions about. But let's talk about manure and cover crops a little bit. Are there ways that you think cover crops and manure application can complement one another?
Absolutely. And I think if you go back to the early 2012s when I started, people would have said no. We looked at manure and said, we're going to inject in it and destroy this cover crop. And I mean, cover crop adoption on manure to acres was lower than all the other acres. And now I think we're getting pretty close to the same, which makes me feel good. But we know manure has some challenges that maybe other fertilizers don't face. We have a timing challenge. I'd like to tell you we're going to fix it tomorrow. It's a tough one to solve. We have 650 commercial manure application companies. They put on about 70% of all the manure, whether it be solid or liquid, and they need about 72 working days to get done. So unfortunately, we're not going to wait until the soil's 50 degrees and cooling and be able to finish. And from a water quality perspective, we'd love to, but I definitely don't want to see the pit overflow. So we have to make some compromises. But because of that, cover crops really help save some of the nitrogen that we're putting on early, hold it in the soil. It'll take some of it up in the cover crop, and we might have to worry about availability differently, but it's holding it on and making sure it'll be there for a future crop.
Yeah, so I guess that's, let's talk a little about both of those things. I think that we've been involved with some work that looked at early fall manure versus late fall manure, and early fall manure with cover crops versus later fall manure. And maybe give us a little summary of that work.
So that's a great one. And Matt basically got me started on that one, getting to work with him. And I think I've done the same thing because we did early fall manure with and without cover crops.
Yeah.
Then I was like, what happens if we move to late fall, and what happens if we move to spring with and without cover crops? So that early fall manure with and without cover crops, 2 things happened. One, the first year was a disaster.
Yeah. We'll just blame it on me. I was still,
I think it's a disaster that other people run into when you're working with manure and cover crops and trying to figure out how to make this all fit together. Sometimes it doesn't go as smooth as you want.
A little more learning curve, maybe.
And that first year, the corn looked pretty short on nitrogen. And I think that's something that we kind of saw throughout. When you had that cover crop with manure for an extended period of time, so we were putting on manure October 1st-ish, growing it with a cover crop, and you might think, oh, cover crops take up 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen. Well, we were getting it to take up 60 pounds of nitrogen. If you just sort of did what was over the band, maybe 80, 90 pounds of nitrogen in that little localized area with scavenging next to it. And we probably needed some more fertilizer. On the other hand, we did that for 3 more years. And every year after that, the cover cropped plots out yielded the control with it, where the manure was at the same time.
Even without any additional nitrogen on top.
That's right. So we had that problem with nitrogen the first year, and you could have said, we're scientists, we're going to correct this. And we said, well, let's keep going. Maybe the cover crop didn't release it. And that would sort of indicate that the cover crop is holding some of that nitrogen and eventually re-releasing it.
Yeah.
Predicting when that might occur, really tough.
Really tough.
But it was holding it there. Yeah.
And I would say that system also, with the cover crop and that early manure, reduced the nitrate concentration compared to early manure without cover crop. So kind of getting that-
Substantially reduced, right? It was about a 40% reduction in the nitrate making it to the tile lines with that cover crop. So huge reduction, remediated all the water quality concerns. It sort of put us in a space where we had to think, how do we just make sure we're getting equivalent yields? And we didn't test it at the time. We sort of have a timing study now where we're supplementing some spring fertilizer with fall to sort of see what would happen. But I think there's ways around that. And if you're adjusting your system, it's pretty easy to say, I think I could get to yield comparable or at least close and still have those water quality benefits. And I think when we move to late fall or spring manure, we've been yield equivalent or better with corn and cover crops and soybean and cover crops compared to our control.
Okay.
Routinely every year with no cover crop.
Okay.
We see the same water quality benefits, maybe not quite as high of a reduction, right? But similar magnitude, maybe 30% reduction in nitrate making it to the tile lines with good manure timing and cover crops.
Here we'll get to some questions we have. So certainly keep those coming in. Has there been a best manure cover crop mixture combination for sandy soils to build soil health in your experiences? And they're kind of asking in this, I think, different manures that might combine with cover crops might help.
So if you're really trying to build soil carbon, soil health, more carbon in the manure is beneficial. So I know swine manure is really prevalent. I love swine manure, lots of available nutrients. But when you start looking at and figuring out how much carbon you're adding, it takes a long time to build soil carbon. So Matt had done work at the national plots before I got there. It had 20 years of manure history. And I think we increased carbon content in those manured plots by about 0.1%.
Yeah, not
and
much.
Almost all the soil health benefits that Brian at the time measured, we didn't see big differences. We did poultry litter studies started by Ramesh Kanwar. So I'm really lucky to have been part of some plots that had been around for a while. That had about 20 years of poultry litter. And there we saw roughly a 0.5% increase in soil organic carbon. And when you measured some of those soil health parameters, aggregate stability, et cetera, we saw an improvement in the stuff that had manure for long periods of time. So if you're really trying to build soil health quickly, I lean towards a solid manure with more carbon in it and also getting the cover crops on. So we have some poultry litter plots west of town here in Ames, and we're doing kind of the same work we did at Nashua. When do we put it on? So some timing study, and then with and without cover crops in a lot of those. And we've had good luck with spring applied poultry litter and cover crops. Maybe not as good of luck in the production side of fall applied poultry litter with cover crops. But in terms of soil health, it's been there. The water quality benefits been there too. And sort of, we have more plots there to play with.
Okay.
And one of the things we tried just this last year is really, can we target a couple practices to improve the crop performance and still take advantage of cover crops? So sort of strip injecting, incorporating poultry litter. So right in the corn row, leaving the other cover crop mostly undisturbed until we kill it, but all the litter right where we're going to grow corn. Or can we put on that litter in the fall and put on some starter nitrogen to get through that initial lag phase? So we're getting data on that, and I think it'll be analogous to both places. But building soil health, I'd think of a solid manure. And then with cover crops, I think you're trying to think about how much biomass can I get on that?
Okay. Next question we have here is, can you speak a little bit to the nutrient availability of organic and inorganic forms with manure and how we value that so that we try not to lose or minimize the potential risk of loss to surface or groundwater?
Perfect. And now I'm going to plug some stuff because I feel like this is a great time to do it. So if you're really interested in that, I run a podcast called Talking Crap. And I did an episode specifically on available or not. So check that one out. There's if you don't want to listen to the whole thing and me rambling about manure, there's a little show notes that summarizes in graphical form like my big key messages. So the place to start is always PMR 1003, using manure nutrients for crop production. And I'm going to say start because that thing needs a few updates from us.
Which we're working on, right?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
which we are working on.
Yeah.
And by working, that means we're going to start this next spring working on it.
Yeah.
But we've thought about it, and there's a few places to change. So swine manure, the ISU recommendation is 90 to 100%. I know in Matt's work and in my work, when we work with swine manure, we're using that 100% available. It really is. When you look at sort of what's coming out of the pit, it's 80% ammonium the day we're pulling it out on average in this state, so 20% organic. So all that ammonium, if we are getting it in the ground, incorporating it, not losing it, that's plant available, right? It's in a form plants can use. So we're really worried about that organic fraction and how quickly it mineralizes. And there you start thinking about what's the C to N ratio based on maybe bedding material added and what we feed the livestock. So if you're feeding stuff that's highly available to start with, corn, soybeans, like we feed to pigs or broilers or turkeys or layers, we're probably thinking that's pretty available.
Okay.
If you're feeding more forages, we're going to lower that availability. But the big one is really how much bedding material have I added and what's the bedding material. So when you look at the ISU recommendations for cattle manure, whether liquid or solid, historically we have said it's 30 to 50% first year available. All the liquid cattle samples that I pull out of a barn these days are 50 to 70% ammonium nitrogen. So our availability is low. We're going to have to move it up. So that's one of the reasons we're working on this. But when you look at the C to N ratios, pig manure is going to be about 8 to 1, a carbon to nitrogen ratio. Yeah. Those liquid cattle manures are going to be about a 12, 15 to 1. So still pretty low. I think of that as mostly moving towards available. If you switch to bed packs or some of the solid manures, turkey litter where we add bedding, you're going to start to push to 20 to 1, okay, maybe up to 40 to 1. And then we might think about lots slower availability. But most people have had good luck, us included, myself included with some of our layer manure, where it should be 60% first year availability of assuming it's higher than that, 75%, and I can get equivalent yields. So okay, look for an update to come on that. Check out that episode and you can see sort of why I'm saying availability is probably higher than what we've given it credit for.
Okay. What types of cover crops have you looked at with manure?
Mostly cereal rye. So almost everything I've done has been cereal rye. But if you're a fan of oats, I'm going to plant oats this year, okay, to compare it directly to cereal rye. And then we with have manure, with manure.
Okay.
Yep. So we won't have oats with and without manure, but we'll have a control with no manure. Yep. We'll have a cereal rye that is interseeded. So I'm going to put it on roughly September 1st, depending on the weather. Oats will be interseeded at the same time, and then we have a cereal rye drilled after oats. So okay, we had been comparing how does timing of when we plant the cover crops interact with manure. I had grown Kentucky bluegrass as a cover crop in those plots that were oats. I had medium success. I was a little hard on my Kentucky bluegrass and eventually killed it out. So it was time to do something else there, and I thought oats might be an interesting choice.
Yeah. So I guess thinking about that, what have you seen as far as folks, think about this, interseeding the cover crop and then we inject in it. Do we inject and then plant the cover crops? I guess how have you seen that and maybe success stories and maybe not success stories?
I think you can actually make almost any of it work. Okay. But if we were sitting back and saying, I want the ideal system, getting your cover crop on early and growing is the most important part, right? Now, if you get rain timely on that, that works great. And if you don't, you might think it's a failure. So I think the first part of what you're deciding to do there is what is going to be your cover crop planting strategy? Is someone flying it on? Am I using a high boy or am I drilling? And how I'm going to think about that with manure is made by that choice. So if I'm flying it on early and getting it growing, I'm going to look for a low disturbance injector, right? So if you are using some of the large plows or sweeps that really cause a fair amount of upheaval, probably not as good. If you are getting to something like Dietrich sweep where it's a little narrower, or maybe some of the vertical till, by the next spring you can't really tell that you drove through it. It looks pretty good, right? So some of the low disturbance injectors, which we've really moved to in the industry, much better for cover crops, much easier on it. But if you're getting it out there early, go ahead and inject into it, no problem. If you are drilling it on, if it's logistically easier to put your manure on first and you know you're still going to be comfortable with your planting date, get it out and then plant your cover crop so you don't destroy any. But any of those systems can work. It's really what fits with what you're going to do and what you have control over. So if you're hiring a commercial applicator, there's some challenge about where you might be on the list and some less flexibility. Get your cover crops on, get them growing. If they say, hey, we're going to be there the day you're harvesting corn, let them go, get your
then
cover crop
drill it.
right on after.
Yeah. There was kind of a question here, kind of as a follow-up to that. When you talk about that, early versus fall, late manure, is there a minimum growth of cover crop that should be in place before that application?
I don't think it has to be in place before the application. And we did some lab studies to try and quantify this. And we basically found in the lab study that yes, if it's up and growing, you're going to do better than if you didn't have it growing, right? But in practice at Nashville, where I've done this timing work, I haven't really seen that follow through. I'd even go so far to say 2 years where we interseeded our rye compared to when we drilled it, I grew the same exact amount of cover crop biomass despite the fact it was out in the field a month earlier, right? So because I'm not giving it ideal growing conditions. This year, where I don't have water, and in those they achieved the same water quality benefit.
Okay.
Maybe not surprising, right?
Yeah.
I got basically the same quality of cover crop, put manure on at the same time. This year, which we haven't harvested yet, but have been collecting water quality data on, I got about 3 times the biomass in the stuff I planted a month earlier for cover crop than what I drilled later. So I think for the first time, I probably will see a water quality difference between those two treatments.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to recognize that the weather that we get in the fall dictates a lot of what our growth is.
Yeah.
And at Nashua, it's not northern Iowa, but it's up there. Some years we get very little cover crop growth, maybe enough to make you sad, right? When you're looking at it.
Yeah, right.
Like I grew
right,
a tenth of a ton per acre.
Yeah.
Not something to write home about.
Yeah.
And we still see a water quality benefit.
Yeah.
So
There's
it
still
still
some
works.
benefit, I think, of that root system in there as well. So, before I miss it or pass it by, what platform is your podcast on? We got somebody interested in it. Awesome. So they would love to listen.
I think you can listen to it on any of your favorite podcasting forums. We posted on Buzzsprout, but then once you're on Buzzsprout, I think they put it out to almost every platform there is. So if you are an Apple person, it's on the Apple Podcast platform. So it's all over. If you look up Talking Crap, you'll find me.
Okay. Thoughts on the water quality or soil health benefits of having cattle grazing on cover crops or just applying manure?
Okay, so I think the cover crops are really what's providing the benefit. Always be growing is, I think, a key strategy for if we're improving water in Iowa, right? And then when we're thinking about maybe cattle grazing those cover crops versus applying manure, if you eat all that cover crop that was on there, cattle are going to deposit something like 70% of the nitrogen that was in the cover crop, right? So if we took up, let's just say, since you didn't put any nutrients on, 30 to 40 pounds, you only excreted probably 20 pounds plus a little bit more for what you fed them, but they're not going to be on that acre very long. We're going to move faster than that. So it's going to improve cycling. And I would probably say, well, we should give a cattle credit. The cover crop was at 40, and we pushed most of that 40 up into first year available because the cattle ate it, digested it, and put it on the ground for us. But it's really not probably a fertility strategy unless you're really letting that cover crop get big and thinking about what am I planting next. There's just not enough biomass there to keep them occupied for long periods of time.
Okay. We're getting some great questions in here. So we'll try to get to a few more of those, try to get to as many as we can here today. I guess here's one that I think you can answer, but they were kind of surprised by the swine manure application only raised the organic carbon levels, organic matter so little over that long period. Maybe talk about that a little bit. We had hoped that we would see this benefit when Brian started that work.
So a couple things on that. When you think about maybe carbon in manure and what we're putting on the soil, you might say, well, I'm putting a lot of carbon on, but you've probably all heard the rule of thumb of corn stover, 10% of it turns into soil organic matter. Turns out manure is about the same. If you look at all the literature that's out there, of all the carbon we put on with manure, about 13% of it gets stabilized on average, right? So if I put on 100 pounds, I'm hopefully turning 13 pounds into soil organic matter.
Yeah.
And swine manure, when you start doing the math on it, it's about 4.5% carbon, right? Which sounds like a lot, but when you start saying, well, there's 50 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, I'm only going to put on 3,000 gallons. I put on 1,800 pounds of carbon, but I only get to claim 10% of that, roughly 180 pounds a year. Well, start doing the math on how much biomass you get with cover crop, and I'm not that big, right? So I think that's why I'm not saying. Also, Iowa starts with a ton of carbon in our soils, so we're adding small amounts to a big amount. If you look at maybe some of the other manure work in surrounding states where we don't start with so much carbon, we make a difference faster. So if you have a field that's really depleted, you can probably do better than us. Nashua has pretty decent carbon
Yeah.
contents in our soil, 4%. So a little bit of change is nice, but it's hard to make big changes when you start with sort of that big pool.
Yeah, from some of that soil health framework, the SMAF framework, all those soils are really good as we
Yes,
look at it.
they all rank extremely healthy.
Yeah, we
Yes.
couldn't see a difference. Yep. I guess thinking another question related to that natural work is that lack of cover crop growth due to growing degree days or precipitation there, would you say?
Some of both.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
Some years we get plenty of
Yeah.
precipitation, and I picked a bad year there for you. We've had years where we've had over 2 tons of cover crop per acre.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, you have good years and bad years. The reason that I didn't get better cover crop growth with what I had been early seeding compared to drilling was I was getting out there great, capturing a rainfall event, getting it germinated, and then when you go another month without any rain, it doesn't grow a whole lot.
Yeah.
Not a lot of light, not a lot of growth opportunities, but some of both. But we have good years and bad years, and some bad years are driven by, man, it's a cold spring and nothing warmed up, and some are, we didn't get much water in the fall to get things growing.
Yeah. Chicken versus turkey manure, which is better?
All manures are awesome. It's figuring out how to use it in your cropping strategy. So it depends on your goals. With turkey litter, right, it has a bedded added product. So I don't assume the nitrogen's is first year available, but it can still be extremely effective. And if I wanted to build soil carbon quickly, I'm looking towards turkey manure. If I want something where I'm really thinking, can I balance nitrogen and phosphorus to a cropping system and really know how much nitrogen I should take credit for, layer manure is probably more consistent because it doesn't have that bedding product in it. But either one can work just fine. And I will admit that in those 20 years of layer manure studies, a couple of years got turkey litter in it, right? Because that's the way it works, and you just adjust accordingly, and you don't see any differences in terms of water quality or in terms of maybe plant production. But I was in a meeting with Matt yesterday, and he was really careful on his wording. We have to get equivalent plant available nitrogen, right? So make sure you're looking at PMR 1003. Look at that handout I made where I differentiate between layer manure and turkey manure and adjust accordingly because you want to get to the plant available part right. And if you're not getting to plant available part, challenges can happen.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more kind of thinking toward the future. Are there any things with manure and cover crops that you're kind of interested in, maybe unique seeding methods? You know, I've heard some people talk about the possibility of injecting planting the rye with the cover crop, trying to put it into the manure stream.
Yep.
I guess, are there any things that excite you, or maybe what are the?
I actually have a few things on this one.
Okay, good.
So Matt and I bought a manure tank that you can actually agitate. So one of the things we've seen in the past is cereal rye loves to float. So you do need a tank with some agitation to keep it mixed in throughout. And I used to say we aren't going to do that because we were so invested in Dietrich sweeps, and putting that cover crop seed 6 inches down probably doesn't work as well. As we went to maybe some of the vertical till, I think there's more opportunities. Now, one thing we have to understand there is if you are a farmer who loves to see a nice uniform stand, we're probably giving up on that. It's concentrated in a band and then less so and then in a band. On the other hand, especially for early manure, I probably want that cover crop right where I put the nutrients, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's some opportunity there. We've had a project with the 360 rain machine, and it's an in-season applicator. And you sort of had the question about what limited your cover crop growth. And I've worked hard to time my cover crop with rain, but man, if it would just pour some water on it afterwards to keep it growing, I wonder if we can do better with some of our cover crop opportunities. So I think those give us a few opportunities on the sort of establishment side.
Yeah.
And then on the management side, I think really thinking about what's the program? How do I think about starter nitrogen? When do I need it? How do I tailor that in my manure system? And can precision placement help with that? So Allison does some of the work on social distancing, and I sort of wonder, when are there opportunities? If I'm doing spring manure, should I be socially distancing my cover crop from where I'm putting my manure? Okay. And can I get away with just manure and not having a starter on there because I did that? And I think some of those opportunities exist, and the precision equipment that's out there finally lets us take advantage of it.
Yeah. I guess, as we think about coming into the manure season, this is kind of a good time to talk about this, and people may still have time to make some plans. I guess if you are, a producer that is, concerned about water quality, apply or has manure applied or applies manure, and maybe they're, they're on that earlier end of when that manure is applied, I guess what would you, give for maybe some guidance or thoughts for them to think about?
I mean, I think that's an easy cover crop win. If you are getting on before November 1, I really want to see a cover crop in your manure. We're putting it out there and we don't know what the weather's
Maybe
going to
not
bring.
with the manure, but
But
applied on
yeah,
that field where we're
on the
getting it.
acres.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to put it
Yeah.
in with your manure. I don't think
Yeah.
there's a lot of data on that,
Yeah.
but there is some data that shows that applying it with your manure can work. But we've definitely seen on that early manure, that's where you have some water quality challenges. We'll often probably say, I know I'm going to have some losses, or I get calls about how much did I lose because I had to
Yeah.
do this, it was my turn. So we tend to up the rate. If you can get cover crops in those fields, they're the most sensitive. You'll have the biggest bang for your buck with cover
Okay.
crop in terms of nitrogen reduced. And I think from the work Matt and I did, it does retain some of that nitrogen and eventually give it back to your crop. Unfortunately, our data probably
Yeah.
suggests it wasn't that first year, but the second year, third year, we got some of that
Yeah.
nitrogen back. So I think you can build that into your soil and into your plan.
Um, okay, we got a couple more. Okay. What about spreading cover crop with chicken litter? Cover crop seed with the chicken litter.
Yeah. So cover crop seed with chicken litter works just fine. I think the challenges you're going to have is how do I get it mixed uniformly to get it spread evenly? Because you like something that's consistent throughout your field, right? I think when I say that we're going to inject it and we get a band of high cover crop intensity, low cover crop intensity, it's still uniform across the field. With some of our litters, depending on how many times it's been flipped and mixed before you get that cover crop seed mixed in, you might get all your seed on 10 acres of that field rather than over the whole field. So I haven't pushed that way. That will never be great on a research plot size. There's too much inconsistency. Can it work? Absolutely. I almost think I would probably, rather than mixing it with the manure, think about what are fixtures I can put on my machine to do both in a single pass. But there are opportunities to do that. I've seen people, though, with cattle manure get their manure on and then in the same pass blow cover crop seed out of a spinner right
Okay.
behind them on top of the manure.
Okay.
With solid manure, cattle bed pack manure, 10 to 20 tons an acre might be a reasonable application rate. That's a little high to be bearing with cover crop seed. So be trying to get your manure underneath the cover crop seed and the cover crop seed sort of mingle in with it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good point. Few more here in the interest of time, but if you have a very healthy soil with above average microbial activity, would you expect kind of any difference in the organic end portion becoming available in manure?
Whew, that is a great question. And I think the easy answer is yes. But in those systems, you have a lot of the rate of turnover is rapid, right? Because we have a high, probably carbon content, we have a high microbial community. And rather than just the rate, it would cycle through an available form, but your microbes might outcompete plants for it as they consume other things. And you might get some tie up again. So would it have been plant available? Absolutely. But it could be tied up relatively rapidly again. So you might not always see it because you need that synchronous of high crop demand right at the moment that the microbe made it, or he's going to be like, it's still there. I'm growing. I need a little more protein. So that question gets a little bit more complicated. But generally, I think when we talk about soil health and water quality and why it could be a good thing is rapid turnover gives a chance for plants to use some, but it also keeps the nitrogen cycle tight. So we don't have available forms floating around maybe to quite the same level.
Somebody here is worried about accumulation of P over years. Do you think including a cover crop would help reduce the risk of P loss from fields?
It absolutely reduces the risk of P loss from fields, but I think there's two parts to that question, right? So cover crops we know are going to help reduce erosion. That reduces the risk of loss. The other part of that question, though, is what is my phosphorus management plan? We don't want to build up phosphorus forever. We wanted to get it to places where we can make a use of it. And that might mean sometimes I put on 4 years worth of phosphorus in a single application with manure. If I'm using turkey litter, I'm probably going to do that. I'm probably going to get 4 years worth of phosphorus and then come back. So cover crops can help hold that phosphorus in the field and keep it for me. But I don't want to show up and be putting like, I'm doing turkey litter and I guess I'm in a continuous corn rotation, so I'm going to do it again. Well, eventually you're building a bank, but we want to live a life too, right? So we want to make some withdrawals from that bank to make sure we're staying in a reasonable zone. So I think both parts of that equation are important. If you are growing that cover crop for forage and harvesting a little bit more, if we started with the high zone, that's a chance to draw some down. ISU has great publications on how to manage phosphorus from a soil test to make sure that you're still sufficient
Yeah.
for corn. So if you're going to do that, just make sure you take advantage of where am I on that soil phosphorus test. And with a lot of manured fields, especially historical manured fields, we might see some high tests where you can harvest that and still not have to put any
Yeah.
phosphorus down.
I guess this is, I sometimes hear this question about probably most related to liquid swine manure fields, but that, we're putting liquid swine manure on every other year. We're continuing to build soil test phosphorus. I think you've talked to me at least about that some of our feeding has changed over the years, and we're not building maybe like we once did 20 or 30 years ago.
And even beyond that, I would go so far to say with liquid swine manure, if you run a corn soybean rotation, we're probably phosphorus deficient. Now, a lot of times I get that question and farmers are concerned. And then when we look at their soil test phosphorus results, they have plenty that it's not a problem for now. We'll start to pull from that reservoir or bank.
Yeah.
But yeah, especially with swine manure, we've adjusted the nitrogen phosphorus ratio to be something like 4-to-1. And if you look at a corn soybean rotation, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 is probably what they're looking for.
Okay.
So if you run a continuous corn rotation, we're probably on our low testing swine manure for phosphorus about in balance for every year application, which is not something I thought I'd see in my career.
Yeah.
I mean, manure scientists have dreamed we're going to develop the treatment system to make a manure look like that, and feed rations helped us out. Cattle, poultry manure, if you're applying frequently, even every other year in a corn soybean rotation, we're still excess phosphorus.
Excess. Yeah. Yeah. And that, I got the, not necessarily related to this, but I did get a question yesterday, that a individual had very high soil test P soils, and they were wondering about applying phosphorus. And I think the recommendation would be the probability of seeing any yield response to additional phosphorus is very low.
That's
And
right.
probably nothing. I think the recommendation is, especially in the day of high fertilizer prices, don't
apply.
Don't apply.
And I think that gives us a manure opportunity, though, in a time of high fertilizer prices. If you've built up that soil test P, it might be a time to say, I could sell this to my neighbor at an appropriate price and buy back nitrogen that I need so that we both come out as winners.
Okay. Couple kind of more manure related questions here. They're seeing more and more hog and cattle buildings that the pits are aerated. How does that affect things?
Well, one, I'd love to see more and more pits where it's aerated too. And I think we've seen a couple, but maybe not a ton of them in Iowa. So most of those are low rate aeration systems or micro aeration. It does two things for you. One, it really helps with odors, right? And I think that's probably the primary reason why people are doing it. And then the second one is it probably gives you a more uniform pit without agitation. So if you think about blowing bubbles in chocolate milk, I know, right?
Like we all did when we were kids, right? Okay, I'm good.
You can see a lot of force that would lift
Yep.
things up,
Yeah.
right? And sort of that keeps solid suspension and more mixed. So you might be able to say, I don't have to agitate as much and I get a more uniform product.
Okay.
There's some discussion on what it will do for nitrogen. And here I'm going to hedge a little bit. Swine manure is already 100% first year available. So you might push more of it into the ammonium form. Maybe I can be 85, 90% when I apply. But it was all first year available. So I'm not convinced there's an advantage. With liquid cattle manures, those barns are really open and microbes need some warmth to work. So when you're aerating them in the winter, are we making a difference? Yes, but it's pretty cold. Like you might see ice chunks floating in that manure.
Yeah.
We're probably not changing the manure significantly. Now, if you're doing a fall application and you've aerated, we might be able to go from something like 70% ammonium to 80% ammonium. So there you could see a little bit different and I might start to tailor it. But those barns in the winter, pretty open, pretty chilly.
Okay. So there is somebody that wrote in that about cover crops and moisture, kind of that a barrier they've heard is that cover crops take up too much of the moisture that might, be needed for the cash crop. Is this actually a significant amount that the cover crop uses? And they recognize it's going to be, like we would say dependent, but I guess what have you seen from that? Maybe I can comment as well.
I think it really does. It's a very much an it depends answer. I think at Nashua the last 2 years, we've had some pretty wet springs. And I don't think cover crops use a ton of moisture, but I've been thankful for every bit of moisture they've used in that corn soybean rotation. I feel like we've gotten better growth and our yields in the soybean indicate that. Now, To your point, I think Matt's done some great work on sort of measuring water balances, and we this year put 5-gallon bucket lysimeters in that we come weigh every week to try and see, did the cover crop change moisture in that soil early season, during the growing season, and late. And it was probably the worst year ever to do that study because we've had rain all the
Yeah.
time that keeps it moist. So the early season moisture probably wasn't our limiting factor. But I think what you're saying is true. And if I knew the weather and how to manage to it, if I'm worried about a dry year, we probably want to terminate a little bit earlier. Now, we're all guessing a little bit in the
Yeah.
spring, but I think there isn't, it doesn't use a ton of water until you really let it start to get a little bit bigger.
Yeah, then we may not be letting it get quite that big. And also one of the things we've seen is we may reduce when we monitored it or evaluated it, we would see a little bit, maybe a little bit of a reduction in soil moisture in the spring when it was growing. But then there was a bit of a mulching effect during the summer as well, if we had gotten that much growth. So I think if you're in, they're probably maybe more of a concern if you're in rain-fed areas in Nebraska where, water limitation is a little bit more. But I think, generally most of our springs, we probably have a little bit of excess rainfall that we would be leaching, and that we might, if we did reduce some of the spring drainage, that wouldn't be all bad. But,
That's right.
But even from our long-term work, we're not really seeing a reduction in spring drainage with cover crops.
The only time I've been able to monitor a reduction in drainage from cover crops is during that 2020, 21, and 22 time period at Nashua, where it was super dry. So dry that we were averaging about an inch of drainage, and we changed it by 1/10 of an inch.
Yeah.
So I think when we're averaging 6 inches of drainage and change it by 1/10 of an inch,
not much. Yeah. But you were still getting some drainage even when you had the cover crop. Okay, I've been given the high sign that I have one more question. Here's one more. On thinking about P&K on a system, they have a corn on corn no-till, and they're removing the corn stover, and they're applying 2 tons per acre of chicken litter. Are they keeping up with the P&K? I feel like I'm putting Dan on the spot and remembering thinking of all of his numbers. But
you're probably keeping up with the P. I'm not so concerned there. What you should pay attention to is your soil potassium test, right? And I'm not going to give you the right answer on this one, but I think a couple things with poultry litter in general when you're thinking about potassium. Potassium's super water soluble. So if you stockpile it for any time period in your field, we oftentimes see a lot of potassium right where that stockpile was. And even if you had a manure sample of what was delivered to you, that might not be the potassium you're putting in your field. So really pay attention to what the soil test potassium is telling you there.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Every time, I think others would agree. Every time I talk to Dan, I learn something different. So now I know a little bit more about stockpiling that poultry manure out in the field. All right. If you've gotten this far, which we have a lot of folks on today, a few last logistical slides. I'm also say keep on the lookout for various events that are coming up with Iowa Learning Farms and ISU Extension and Outreach coming up. We have a lot of things going on yet this summer. And I want to really thank our key funding partners that have made and make the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series possible. Those include the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So thank you very much again to those partners that make this possible. All right, if you watch this webinar live and want to earn a CCA CEU, email Elena Whitaker by 5 o'clock today. And her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Include your name, the name you enter to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, by 5 o'clock today, email alenaw@iastate.edu. Next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. If you've done it for a 2026 webinar, you're done. Thanks very much. But if this is your first one, or maybe you've watched a couple and haven't done it, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could fill out the survey. You can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey or scan the QR code. And now the last slide. Ooh, okay, I'm going to be gone, but we'll have Mark Lick talking about the agronomics of relay intercropping. So he has some great information on that. Mark is the co-director of the Iowa Soybean Research Center, associate professor and extension system specialist in the Department of Agronomy here at Iowa State University. So tune in to Mark. And as always, our webinars are archived as long as the recording work. It'll be available soon on the Iowa Learning Farms website, or there's a dedicated channel on YouTube just to our webinars. So again, thank you very much. Somebody wanted to show the CCA details again, so maybe Liz is on the spot to bring that back up. Again, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Dan, for participating in our Beyond the Basics series of interview format. As always, it's my pleasure to get to do this, and I think you brought some great information to the table, as always, as expected.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you for all the Beyond the Basics. I think it's been a great addition to the webinar series.
Yeah, I say they're a lot of fun to do. I don't want to do them every week, but once every month, it's pretty darn good. So if you have some folks that you think would be good that we can get in person to do this series, please email Mitch Harding at Iowa Learning Farms. So everybody, thanks a lot, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.